Teachers who taught future murderers and major criminals, what were they like? Story 1. One of my former students murdered 2 people, apparently on a drug deal gone wrong. He is now serving life in prison. I had him in 1st grade. Sweet kid, highly intelligent. Seriously, he was reading on a 3rd grade level, despite the fact that he came in late every day. Not just 10 or 15 minutes late, usually he would come in around 10 o'clock. Dad was not in the picture, in prison for gang activity, and Mom was unconcerned about his education. I tried everything I could to impress on her just how intelligent her son was, and how he had a very bright future, but that he needed to be in school. She honestly didn't seem to care. He later dropped out when he was in high school, joined a gang, and things snowballed. Such a goddamned waste. Story 2. Way late to the party, but I'll give this a go. I taught at a secure facility somewhere in England for around 3 weeks as temporary stopper, until they could find the right candidate, so not strictly. Went on to commit a crime, more of had committed a crime, but still needed education. We had one boy who was on trial for arson, nothing intentional. He flicked a cigarette butt, and it set fire to his neighbor's car. He'd apparently had a few minor run-ins with the local police once or twice already, so he was pretty much a goner in terms of getting arrested for it. The worst of the 4 students under our care, though, was a kid who had snapped. He came home one night, when he was supposed to be staying at a friend's, to find his stepdad on top of his kid's sister. Didn't warn the guy what was about to happen, just went to the garage, grabbed a hammer, and went to town on him. He called the police himself, never denied what he'd done but wasn't proud of it. In his own words, it just needed doing. That stayed with me. He wasn't even with us because the prosecution were pushing for his incarceration. They just wanted to see how badly he'd snapped, and if he was a danger to himself/others. So, yeah, not really in the same vein as a lot of these stories, but that's my contribution. Story 3. I had a group of students that I was very close to. They were all in a gang, what they called the FO for the 2 gang. It was a local member of the Crips. 2 of them in particular I took particular interest in, having them in my home for dinner once a week, tutoring them every day after school for all subjects. I picked them up for school and dropped them off every day. I got them both jobs and drove them to work. They had pretty violent backgrounds, but I trusted them. They were like my own children before I had my own, actual children. Unfortunately, things started going downhill with the older one. He stole from my wife a lot of valuables, then refused to acknowledge he had done anything wrong since he said he needed it more than we did since his lights were off. I put up a pretty strong boundary with him after that, and he stopped coming around as much, and started walking to school again, which means he didn't come very often. The other student, X, had a horrible home. No parents, grandma couldn't really take care of him, siblings in jail or on drugs, etc. I offered to let him live with us for a few months for some reason that I can't remember now. It sounds stupid, but that actually worked out. He never took from us. He was always grateful. His grades went up a bit. He even got jumped out of his gang after I asked him to. It really was a nice beginning. About 4 to 6 months into him living with us, we were watching The Office, and he was laughing really hard at some joke, when all of a sudden he stopped laughing, got this real somber look, then got up, went to his room, and wouldn't talk to us. He got up the next morning, and told us he wanted to move out. At first he wouldn't tell me why. After a while of pressing him, he said he felt guilty enjoying life while his sister had to live in back with his grandma. He felt he was ready to take care of her, and no amount of me trying to convince him he had to take care of himself first would dissuade him, so he moved out the following week. After he graduated the next year, I changed schools and slowly lost contact with him. He got fired from his job for no call, no showing 3 times in a month. I got him another job, but the same thing happened. Finally, we lost touch. This was about 7 years ago or so. About 7 months ago, I get an email from a lawyer. He tells me that his client asked him to get in contact with me. It's X. He had been convicted of murder. There is a news article on it, but I don't think I should post it, even though it's public record and all. But he basically walked into a room, shot a guy he had no beef with for no discernible reason to anyone, then walked out without robbing him. I am pretty upset about it. Part of my feelings revolve around sadness, obviously, but there is also guilt for not getting it right / saying the right things / whatever. I knew he had violent tendencies, but I saw a non-violent side of him who liked Michael Scott and cooking. I had hoped that the better angels of his nature would win out, but obviously they didn't. I'm not sure I could have done anything different, and in some ways the experience has embittered me about the ability of people to be saved, although I don't think that word fits exactly. I definitely won't take those extreme measures again, partly because it seems like it was all for naught, and partly because I think it was riskier than I realized at the time. Story 4. I've taught 4 students who have been involved with murders. 3 killed one guy together, and the 4th shot a person at a hotel party and killed them. I worked at an alternative school, so they had behavioral issues. Only one of them struggled academically. They were all class clowns. The one thing that sticks out is that all of them struggled to fit in. They felt like they had something to prove. The 3 kids came in the day after they committed the murder. You could tell something was off. They left early, and later we heard what happened. The whole situation is still really clear in my mind. Fucked up stuff. Story 5. So, I've taught a couple attempted murderers and quite a few major drug dealers, as well as students that would become accessories to murder, stuff like selling the eventual murderer a stolen firearm. So this isn't going to be super specific to one kid, but here goes. The ones that truly gangbang hard tend to be the sweetest ones. They'll come up to me and ask how my spring break was, and answer questions in class, and defend me if students give me a hard time. Those ones are usually in too deep because the older heads tell them not to fuck around at school and get as many positive character witnesses as possible when they end up getting caught up. The ones that just joined a gang of their friends and go around selling a little bit of weed act a fool in class because there's no authority structure telling them the gang doesn't need that kind of negative attention. I've had heroin dealers in class, and the 3 or 4 of them were so kind, but trying to find the human inside them is so hard because of the drug abuse. It's like that episode of Black Mirror with the tiny person living inside their head. You want nothing more than to see them snap out of it, and sometimes they do. We had one of our most serious junkies graduate in December. The ones who get to me the most are the ones that identify with me, and then go out and do horrible things. I'm a younger dude that worked in the music industry, so I have a lot of kids that just inherently think I'm cool despite tons of evidence to the contrary. So I'll know a kid for 3 years and love them to pieces, and then see them in the paper for aggravated assault. Those ones sting the most. Story 6. I volunteered a couple of times at an alternative school. One of my pastors was the principal there, so our church youth group would help out from time to time. I was in a 4th grade classroom and was tasked with helping a boy learn to read. It was basic stuff: cat, dog, ran, etc. He had a task to spell cat and dog, and couldn't or wouldn't try to see the difference. He said he'd never need to know how to read, so why should he? I told him I'd draw some pictures of what the words were next to the words so he could try to memorize them. He said something along the lines of, "If you try to make me do this, I'll slit your throat and fuck your corpse." Note, was a 275-pound dude. I told the teacher, who told me not to worry, that they check him daily to make sure he's not carrying a knife since he's had a few incidents. Not sure what happened to that kid, nothing good. She'd also previously told me he wasn't allowed pencils or pens, and was only allowed to write with crayons due to his violent outbursts. If he's still alive, he'd be around 25 now. Coincidentally, I mean that literally, I'm not being glib, I didn't end up volunteering there again. I did drive past there once and saw a bunch of kids beating the crap out of one kid outside. I called 911 and was thanked for the report, and that police were already on site. Story 7. Had an 8th grader who was a jerk. Wouldn't listen, constantly disrupted the class, and put in little to no effort. Was a bully to the other students. Unfortunately, our admin at the time was a pushover, so nothing ever happened when we would refer him or anyone else. One day he came back from the office, and I overheard him telling a classmate, when asked what happened, that the principal gave him some candy and sent him back to class. Cut to 6 years later, see his face on the news being arrested for a gang murder. Not the least bit surprised. Story 8. I taught at an alternative school for a year. I have several students who later ended up in jail for everything from robbery to murder. Most of them weren't surprising. These were kids who clearly had no family structure or discipline at home. And almost all of them were affiliated with gangs somehow. We even had middle school kids jumped into gangs at the school. But alternative schools get almost no support from anyone but the police. It's basically a step away from jail. The one who committed murder killed a pizza delivery driver over a drug deal. He was actually somewhat surprising, because he was far from the worst kid I dealt with. He was a skinny, nerdy-looking kid with braces, but he was hanging out with all the hard gang members too. I don't know, maybe he felt like he had to prove himself. Story 9. Oh, the last one from this one school site. I worked there for 8 years and really loved it. It shaped me as a teacher, and I got to work with thousands of amazing kids. This one kid's dad was in a bike gang. I worked with him for a year as a sophomore. He hated school, the system didn't work for him, and even though he acted out a lot and spent a lot of time suspended and expelled for smoking, drugs, and kicking off, we maintained a respectful relationship. He barely completed any work the year, but I was just glad he came to classes. I didn't teach him again, but he always stopped for a chat and a bit of banter. He was adamant he didn't want to follow in his dad's footsteps and started a construction course where he really excelled. He had found something he was naturally talented at. A few years after he had left school, he ended up working for his dad, both the actual business front and the drugs, weapons, and rivalry part. He was stabbed to death in a drug deal gone bad. I didn't go to his funeral as I hadn't seen him for a few years, but I expressed my condolences to his family and friends. He was 19. We had discussed the fact that he may end up in jail if he went into the family business. I never thought he wouldn't make it to his 20th birthday. Story 10. While I was a student teacher, I taught a young man who planned a school shooting for the night of his prom. He had weapons and apparently fully intended to harm his classmates, but was arrested after he made some alarming comments. He seemed like a nice kid, but very strange and withdrawn. He used to try to make jokes and witty comments, but was just awkward and got shut down a lot. Honestly, he was exactly what you imagine a kid who has been bullied but still tries to make friends would be like. I suspect he was on the spectrum as well, but never diagnosed. I feel bad for him despite the terrible things he planned to do. His classmates ended up raising a sizable amount of money and donating it to mental health charities, and they did eventually have their prom just before the end of the school year. The student served about 6 months in prison jail and was given a few years of probation. Story 11. I am a teacher now, however I wasn't a teacher when this happened. I was working at a juvenile detention center, which they were saying was a treatment center. We were not a facility that held major offenders. One kid was in there for getting caught with some marijuana. He was in for like 3 to 6 months, which was harsh for a first-time offender, but the judge was notorious for this kind of thing. We had kids from that area who were sent to us after skipping school a few times. He was really mellow, liked to play card games, and was very mature. When the younger kids would be starting fights or bickering, he would always distance himself and just sort of remove himself from everything. A year after he left us, he was caught trafficking serious amounts of narcotics. He was sentenced to something like 20 years for that and the various offenses which led up to him getting caught. I'll just answer a couple of questions for the curious. 1. This was in Wyoming in 2014 to 2015 was going on for longer, but that was when I was there. 2. I went to college originally to be a juvenile defense attorney and worked in Boston's court systems for a while, and I'm aware of how juvenile court works. In Wyoming, we just don't have that great of a system. There is a pretty set standard for punishment along the board, except with this one judge who was overly harsh, and her punishment was always our facility first if we had the beds. That's why we all thought it was strange, and we did send a bunch of paperwork and numbers to Child Services, which got our facility shut down. It didn't affect her that I know of. The supervisor in charge of reporting it, and who had the copies, killed himself 3 years ago, so I'm not exactly sure what kind of investigation could be done now. Our facility got axed, and it was a corrupt place itself. 3. I know the judge's name, but who knows if she was really in on some corruption. She could totally just be a hard ass and think that our treatment center was what these kids needed. It's just strange that it was always our center and not another place unless there were no beds. Story 12. Grade 6. A small boy who talked tough and ran a mini gang of bigger boys. Poor student. The only thing he did well was athletics, amazing runner, but wasn't allowed on the teams because his marks were so bad. His mother looked about my age, and I was an undergraduate student teacher. I got that through word of mouth. I never met her because she'd cancel at the last minute any parent-teacher meetings. There were a lot of requests for these meetings. No father figure in his life. Free-range kid in the worst sense. Couldn't respect anyone more than 2 years older than him unless they were black or willing to throw down with him right there. He knew how to manipulate people. He definitely manipulated me. About 10 years later, I found out in the news he dropped out of high school to do gang things and was part of an interview/study on rehabilitating kids like him. I don't buy any of it because it's the same stuff he told me. Also in the news article was that he shot some people in a condo and was later killed in a police shootout. Story 13. As a substitute teacher, I subbed several classes with a student who would later be responsible for murder. He was certainly an obnoxious character, loud and disruptive. I remember subbing him in P. He was being overtly aggressive in a game of indoor soccer, and other students seemed to avoid him. I'm guilty of being slightly happy when he fell and injured his knee. Later I asked him how his knee was, and he seemed caught off guard that I even remembered. I subbed the kid he murdered too. He was also a disruptive kid. I actually remember making him sit in the hall because he couldn't stop talking during a test, but other than that he seemed like a nice kid. I even spent some time talking to him. I guess there was some kind of dispute over drugs. The guy beat the other kid to death. I'm not even sure he meant to murder him. He ended up burying him out in the desert, and his body was quickly discovered in a shallow grave. Now he's got a life term. From high school to prison. Story 14. I taught a student who turned out to be a pedophile. I met him at the age of 16, and he had watched his mum die of cancer. It happened at the start of the school year, and it struck me as strange that he didn't take any time off to grieve with his family. We had one clash of wills when I took the class outside to compose poetry. He refused and started walking around smacking stuff with a large stick. He refused to go to the focus room and was collected by exec staff. I didn't teach him after that semester and was grateful. He was so clever, but difficult to engage. He had that dead-eye stare that I associate with kids with diagnosed depression, eating disorders, or burgeoning personality disorders. It takes one to know one. I was an ill young lady in my late teens. The trouble started after he finished school. He didn't complete matriculation, but was heavily involved in sports and coaching. And that is when and where he started grooming younger boys online. Much younger boys. Pre-teens. He was arrested when he was in his early 20s and put on good behavior. He violated his terms of bail in under 6 months and is now in jail. The thing is that I also taught his sister, and although subject to the same significant trauma, she handled it very differently. She is immensely successful and has excelled. I really feel for their dad who lost his partner and his son in such a short time frame. Story 15. I used to run an after-school program at an at-risk junior high school. I had a student who was a typical middle school dude, loud, rambunctious, but very coachable. He was very aware of how his actions affected others and generally was respectful. The only thing that I saw as an issue was his temper. Cross him once, he probably didn't speak to you for days. We butted heads often, but he came back for all 3 years he was in that junior high. I was very upset when he left. We always had a saying when we left school for the day: go home, eat dinner, sleep well, and don't do dumb things. 2 years later, 2016, I get an email from his mom that says, "You're probably going to be hearing about student in the news tonight. But I wanted you to know that student is really sorry and said he didn't listen to your advice and did something dumb." The student killed another student in a local park, pretty brutally. Beat him to death and stabbed him as well. All over a designer belt. He's in prison now. I received an email the day before he was sentenced that said, "I'm sorry, Code Danger, thanks for everything. Don't do dumb things like I did. It'll stick with me forever. You really never know." I've since moved on to my 3rd district now that I teach in, and there are so many different students that it is impossible to really see indicators of these kinds of things. All of them are as shocking as the last. Story 16. I taught 3 students that together went on to commit at least one locally high-profile murder, and probably others, and will likely die in prison as a result of them. 2 of them are brothers, Adam and Brian. It became apparent pretty early on that their house had drug issues, and there was some serious neglect going on. Physical abuse, too, from little things the boys let slip. They rarely had lunches, never had winter coats, and their shoes regularly were being glued or duct taped together. They'd talk about fights at their house, drug use, drunk parents, all sorts of things. We reported everything the entire year they were in my classroom, trying to get some intervention. They were actually from a fairly large family, 6 or 7 kids, but it never turned into anything. As students, they were entitled and did things like cutting in lines, or taking someone else's candy, and rowdy, but not entirely stupid. I think the total lack of discipline at home, never having consequences for not doing homework, was a huge contributing factor to how they ended up. Adam was not the brightest bulb. He was a follower for sure, and a little bit of a bully. He'd posture to show off, but if you pressed him, he'd back down. Never had problems with him in the classroom. After the first week, just in the halls or recess or at the bus stops. Acted tough, but at least when I knew him, it was a fairly unconvincing act. Brian was always kind, when neither of the other two co-murderers were around. A really quiet kid, a thinker, but he stuck by his brother like glue. I guess they didn't have much else going for them, nobody else to watch their backs, so they were 100% together in pretty much everything. I really hoped Brian'd end up in a better place. He was brighter, kinder, and patient. Liked to read. I had hope with him. I thought, if any of them have a chance, it's him. And if it weren't for the third kid they fell in with, Carl, he probably would have. Carl was a problem kid, had a file thicker than a dictionary. I saw him stab a kid for no reason, and then say it was because he wanted to see what happened. We had to remove all scissors from our classroom, because he liked to cut things. He threw a desk once. Mid-story time, no apparent trigger. Just got up, threw it at a girl, and then laughed when she started crying. He was a nightmare on the bus, on the playground, and so on. He had a recess duty assigned to keep an eye on him, because whether he directly did it or not, kids got hurt when he was around. He talked about killing animals, going hunting, and about doing things like taking people into the woods, getting them really lost, and then leaving them to die. He was a creep. He liked to pick on little girls. Not the ones in his grade, but ones 4 to 5 years younger. He'd corner them and bully them to tears, sometimes physically snatching at their dresses or pulling their hair. He was awful, and constantly in and out of the principal's office. Adam worshipped Carl, or followed him around like it, anyway, and Brian, well, he stuck with his brother. It was so sad to see happening. They all lived in the same area, and knew one another outside of school, and I always got the impression that Brian was afraid of Carl. I know some of the other teachers in the building were. Hell, I'll even admit I was too. I was on constant guard with him in class. He even in elementary school was fully capable of doing some serious permanent harm, and we all knew it. Together, while still in high school, they abducted and killed a classmate. Story 17. I taught in a pretty rough area in the inner city US for a decade. Mostly Latino and illegal immigrant kids. I've had my share of serious drug dealers, gang kids, and the like. Despite their fair share of felonies, overall they were okay kids who made some bad choices, didn't get the support they needed, or were just raised in that lifestyle. They never scared me, or were too much to handle. There was a lot of honor there within the community. They honestly tended to control themselves, or work together when asked. Obviously low academic skills, but trying when they were around. Being a pretty big male who can take a joke, talk crap, and speak Spanish really helped. Some of my more privileged or female co-workers had a lot of issues with student discipline. I luckily did not. Now I had one skinny crazy-eyed white kid we'll call Brian. Brian was terrifying. The super scary gang kids were like, no F way I'm sitting anywhere near him. In and out of state institutions since he was probably 5. God knows what the hell happened to him to F him up so badly. A newer kid called him crazy one day, and Brian went after that kid like a wild animal. Like I said, I'm a decent-sized dude and have broken up a lot of fights. Me and this other giant kid struggled to hold him back. Brian eventually was expelled from our school, over that and many other things. He aged out of the school and juvie system at 18. I saw the news about a year and a half later. He had broken into a nice suburban home, murdered the family of 4 there, and was just chilling in the house. They caught him when the neighbors noticed no one coming or going for a few days. God knows what terrible stuff he did in there, before and after they died. Story 18. I have had a handful of students go to jail for murder. Most cases were gang-related, and some were drug deals gone bad. I have had a handful of students get shot. One of my seniors was murdered earlier this year in a shooting outside of a bar. His mother called him to help her in a fight with the owner. He got into a shootout with the owner. His mother survived, but he did not. That one really hurt. All of these students were good kids in class. They were never disrespectful towards me. They did their work. They gave me hugs, smiled good morning, and told me their hopes and dreams. However, I know that they live in one of the most violent communities in America. I can't allow what they do outside of my classroom to impact what happens in my classroom. It is not my place to judge them. I know many of my students are involved in gangs and drug dealing, and these incidents will continue to happen. It is a heartbreaking reality I have come to accept. My job is to teach them not only my subject area, but also to teach them the basic life skills they need to survive. Their home lives are often out of control. They are scared to walk home from school. I am not naive enough to think that guns are not sometimes hidden away in backpacks. I try to show them love and provide them with a place they feel safe and supported. For every child who has died or killed another, there are so many more who have gone on to do truly amazing things. We have numerous Gates Scholarship winners. One of my students last year earned a full ride to Stanford. My students are kind and brilliant. They are also terrified, live in abject poverty, and have to fight for their futures. Sometimes they lose the fight and people die. I want to be clear. I have never once felt afraid of my students. I love teaching here. They call my mom. They tell me they love me. I go to weddings, baby showers, and grieve with them at funerals. I would not want to work anywhere else. Story 19. Unfortunately, I have had more than one former student commit high-profile murder. The longer you teach, the statistical likelihood of having a student like this increases, of course, but I would say that number is higher than one would expect from a suburban school. What strikes me was the cruelty in their personalities. Not necessarily sociopathic, but the unwillingness to care about other kids, reveling in the humiliation of other students. Combine that with parents/guardians who refuse to accept any responsibility for their child's behavior, usually pointing the finger right back at the school for anything really, and you have a kid whose aggression, defiance, etc. is enabled right up until they take another person's life. Schools do have a problem of addressing behavior in a way that reflects a consistent application of a code of conduct, and we don't have the funding or infrastructure to deal with the proliferation of behavioral and emotional disorders in a meaningful and effective way. Suspensions improve the classroom environment, at least temporarily, but they don't do much to address and improve problem behaviors in students who need it the most. That's one of the factors that contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline. And no, I'm not overlooking or ignoring discrimination, and some teachers and admin are just plain awful. And as a teacher, you begin to realize how crucial it is to have quality parenting and other support systems in children's lives. Poverty is so destructive. I don't know how we as teachers in our school could have course-corrected the kids who would later commit murder. You try to teach empathy, responsibility, kindness, but if a child doesn't fundamentally understand respect for humanity, then we are at a loss. And sadly, when you see a former student's face on the news because he or she committed a capital crime, your reaction isn't as much shock as it is sad resignation. Story 20. One of my former students, one I loved dearly, just murdered his girlfriend. He shot her 18 times. In school, he was a likable troublemaker, a nice kid trying to maintain a bad boy persona. He showed up so high once. He had a backpack full of Oreos and Doritos just loose in the main pocket, and he kept missing his mouth as he tried to eat them. He used his cooler-than-you social status to stand up for a younger kid who was being picked on. He hated his dad. He didn't take anything seriously, but he was funny and clever, and it was hard to be mad at him. He did have obsession with guns, but I truly would have sworn up and down that he wouldn't have harmed someone unprovoked. He accidentally left a pocket knife in his backpack once, and I went to bat for him to prevent him from being expelled, testifying to the school board that I was confident it wasn't intentional and that he would never intentionally hurt anyone. I was obviously wrong, and now I don't trust how I read people. It's really shaken me. I had this kid every day for 2 years, and I truly just thought his gun fascination was from his tough guy image and desire to go into the military. Story 21. I taught at an alternative school where a lot of the home circumstances for the kids set them out on unpleasant trajectories in life. Some kids were assholes, but most were just kids trying to make sense of the hand they were dealt. High-stakes perception challenges, all while dealing with typical teenage bullshit. I knew jail time was a likelihood for a significant portion. I worked with most for multiple years in different subjects and found most were not evil-hearted people. Unfortunately, I know the must transform to totally different people outside the safety of the classroom. Example: a young man who was the oldest of 7 kids. His dad was not in the picture, and his mom was often not around. He felt it was on him to be the man of the house and support the family, so he got involved with MS-13 at a young age. Despite his outward appearance as a thug, he was a good student and stood up for the more socially awkward kids in class. He was supposed to move to a different state and started falling back on his involvement with the gang. The move fell through, but the gang got wind of the intention and told him he had to reprove his loyalty, or he and his siblings were dead. I found this all out when the police picked him up from school, because he was caught on camera beating another young man to death with a baseball bat. The police didn't tell me, his counselor did. Ironically, I found that the more cold-hearted of them were the least likely to get in trouble at school, and probably the most likely to not end up behind bars, as they knew how to play people off each other to get their own means met. Story 22. Obligatory, not a teacher, but I might have better insight because I grew up with a kid and saw him from kindergarten to our senior year of high school when he killed his mom. We were in most of the same classes in elementary school, on a peewee football team together, sat next to each other in 4th grade, were in school plays together, etc. His dad had passed away when he was an infant. His mother didn't have it all together, but was a nice woman but definitely wasn't strict with him. He had moments when he was the nicest kid and others when he would lash out. I remember him getting upset over something in 2nd grade and kicking the teacher a number of times. He got in verbal fights somewhat regularly with other students, and I remember in 4th grade, he got seated next to me because I was one of the only kids he got along with. He was also generally pretty strange. I remember once after peewee football practice, he was waiting for his mom to pick him up, and he laid in the middle of the street, as the sun was setting, throwing rocks up at cars as they drove by his head. So there were a ton of warning signs. And I remember teachers and administrators appealing to his mom to get him to see some type of therapist and maybe get put on some medication. His mom refused to believe there was anything wrong with her son, and after enough incidents, she pulled her son from school and homeschooled him in the later middle school/early high school years. I didn't see much of him during these years, but one incident of his showed up in the news when we were about 16 where he stole his mom's car and led police on a high-speed chase before eventually crashing into someone's house. I guess he did some 4-month juvenile boot camp thing as punishment. Around my junior or senior year of high school, I started seeing him around school again, though at this point he had fallen back a grade. What I didn't realize was that at some point he had a falling out with his mom and moved out on his own with 2 friends. His issues with his mom continued. When we were 18, his mom sold her house, and he wanted her to give him money from the sold house. She refused, and so he hatched a plan with his 2 roommates to rob her in the middle of the night. One roommate stayed in the car as the getaway driver, and the other went in with the guy I knew. When they got there, the robbery plan turned to murder plan right away as he jumped on her while she was asleep and tried to break her neck. When that didn't work, he stabbed her a number of times and tried to slit her throat. He didn't do a great job at either, and she managed to crawl all the way downstairs and within a few feet of her phone, pre-cell phone days, before she bled out. The other kids had not signed up for a murder, and the getaway driver turned himself into police the next morning. My understanding is that the getaway driver served some time in prison, eventually got out and died, not sure how. The guy I knew and the roommate are still serving life sentences. So yeah, there were always signs. Teachers asked his mom to get him help. She refused. He murdered her,